Mansfield Park. Through Fanny Price's eyes. In this video, I intend to consider a short passage from Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, a passage that concerns itself with the 18-year-old heroine of the novel, Fanny Price, looking out on a scene that's taking place some way away from her. First, a little necessary background to the novel. Fanny Price, the niece of the well-to-do Sir Thomas Bertram, has been semi-adopted by the Bertram family of Mansfield Park as an act of charity towards the Price family, who are comparatively poor and overburdened by many young children. This semi-adoption of Fanny was meant well by Sir Thomas, but the reality of Fanny's life at Mansfield Park is that she's all too often ignored and slighted, though usually with the exception of her cousin Edmund, who appreciates her qualities and treats her with considerable kindness. And this kindness includes the regular loan of one of his horses, so that she can have the pleasure and exercise of riding sessions on a daily basis. Fanny, by nature somewhat timid and physically less than robust, did not at first take readily to riding, but with practice and careful consideration by those teaching her to ride, she's come to love her daily outing on horseback. The passage I want to consider begins with Fanny waiting for the horse to be brought up to the house for her lesson, only to find that it hasn't arrived. What has happened is that Edmund has taken the horse to be used by the lively and pretty Miss Mary Crawford, a newcomer to the area who is learning how to ride. Edmund has promised Fanny that the horse will be brought back in good time for her ride, but under the spell of the infatuating Mary Crawford, he has forgotten Fanny and broken his promise to her. One more thing before I read the passage. It's important to appreciate that Fanny loves Edmund, not just as her dearest friend at Mansfield Park, but with a romantic love as well, though the latter is locked secretly in her heart. The passage goes as follows. By walking 50 yards from the hall door, Fanny could look down the park. And in Dr. Grant's meadow, she immediately saw the group. Edmund and Miss Crawford, both on horseback, riding side by side. Dr. and Mrs. Grant and Miss Crawford's brother, with 2 or 3 grooms, standing about and looking on. A happy party it appeared to her, all interested in one object, cheerful beyond a doubt, for the sound of merriment ascended even to her. It was a sound which did not make her cheerful. She wondered that Edmund should forget her, and felt a pang. She could not turn her eyes from the meadow. She could not help watching all that passed. At first, Miss Crawford and her companion made the circuit of the field, which was not small, at a foot's pace. Then, at Miss Crawford's apparent suggestion, they rose into a canter, and to Fanny's timid nature it was most astonishing to see how well Miss Crawford sat. After a few minutes they stopped entirely. Edmund was close to her. He was speaking to her. He was evidently directing her management of the bridle. He had hold of her hand. She saw it, or the imagination supplied what the eye could not reach. First thing to note about the passage is that Fanny is alone and some way from the other people in the scene. She's looking from the vantage point of a heightened position, which enables her to take in the whole picture. And she's not noticed by anyone caught up in the action below her. Fanny's aloneness is something that recurs as a theme throughout the novel. It's sometimes a good aloneness, where she's content with her own company and able to think or read or work in peace. And it's sometimes an unpleasant aloneness, in which she's been shunned, slighted, ignored, forgotten. Her aloneness in the passage is of this latter kind. As she watches the scene, her isolation from what is called the happy party below her is complete. She's alienated from their cheerfulness, their merriment, which she's able to hear but not share. As the narrator says, "It was a sound which did not make her cheerful." She wondered that Edmund should forget her, and she felt a pang. The next sentence in the passage takes us further into Fanny's inner life. She could not turn her eyes from the meadow. She could not help watching all that passed. This sentence gives us two descriptions, each of which is in itself a short but complete sentence. Two descriptions of Fanny's state of mind, making exactly the same point each time, namely, that Fanny's intense gaze seems frozen in position, as her will to change it appears to be completely paralysed. I'll give you the essence of the whole sentence again. She could not turn her eyes. She could not help watching. The repetition here, emphasised by the identical pattern of "she could not," reinforces our sense of the utterly mesmerising effect on Fanny of what she's seeing. And the use of just a comma between the two very similar statements gives a sense that they're almost fused together to intensify the meaning. Jane Austen here is conveying a picture of Fanny acting as a kind of eavesdropper, or more accurately, illicit observer. With her free will and indeed her moral sense, she above all people knows that she should not be continuing to watch. With her free will and moral sense imprisoned by an overwhelming compulsion. And she's an illicit observer who witnesses something that does herself no good at all. Indeed, as shown already in Jane Austen's use of the word pang, actually brings her acute emotional pain. Throughout the novel, Fanny is shown to be a rational, virtuous person. But here, she's only too human in the masochistic folly of being gripped by the desire to see what hurts only herself. Just a few lines later, after a mention of how Fanny is astonished at how confidently and skillfully Mary Crawford is riding, comes the final sentence of the passage. Here it is. After a few minutes, they stopped entirely. Edmund was close to her. He was speaking to her. He was evidently directing her management of the bridle. He had hold of her hand. She saw it, or the imagination supplied what the eye could not reach. This long sentence falls into two halves. The larger half consisting of a series of what are actually very short sentences, separated only by commas. I'll give you these short sentences again. After a few minutes, they stopped entirely. Edmund was close to her. He was speaking to her. He was evidently directing her management of the bridle. He had hold of her hand. What we have here, once the introductory part about Edmund and Mary stopping their ride is over, is a list of actions performed by Edmund in relation to Mary. He comes close to her, speaks to her, directs her use of the bridle, holds her hand. After Edmund's name has been given at the start of the list, he's reduced to the pronoun he. And Mary's given no name at all, but indicated by the pronoun her. There's a pared down, repetitive quality to the expression here. He plus verb plus her, again and again, giving a sense of an intense focus on these two figures, the significant man and significant woman in the observed scene. Note how there were originally 7 or even 8 people mentioned. Dr. Grant, whose meadow is the scene for the action, Dr. Grant's wife, Mary's brother, 2 or 3 grooms, and Edmund and Mary themselves. All these people are still present, but 5 or 6 of them have melted away. Melted away, that is, in the consciousness of Fanny, who's observing the scene with eyes for the only 2 people that matter to her. Note how Fanny isn't mentioned during this list of short sentences. She has, as it were, become absorbed into the list, which has become not just a record of what's happening in the meadow, but simultaneously an imitation of Fanny's consciousness working like a camera eye as she observes with riveted attention what is happening. The light punctuation means that there's no more than a split second's pause between each of the short sentences. The effect is one of speed, not just of the actions observed, but of the mental process of the observer of the actions as she hurries from one telling action to another. The last detail in the series of Fanny's observations is the climactic one, where Edmund takes hold of Mary's hand. And only after this point is the punctuation strengthened as we move to the second part of the overall sentence. The punctuation strengthened by a semicolon giving a distinct pause before the final striking words, which explicitly remind us that it is Fanny who has been the camera eye for the list of observations in the first part of the sentence. She saw it, or the imagination supplied what the eye could not reach. This extra detail is a masterstroke by Jane Austen. The likelihood is, of course, that Fanny is simply too far away to observe this last small detail, instead imagining that it takes place, though this process of imagining is so strong that it has, at least for a moment, the force of reality to her. This imagination of Fanny's is born out of her own suppressed romantic feelings for Edmund, mixed with jealousy towards the woman she sees holding an actual romantic position in Edmund's affections. Hand-holding would indeed be a distinctive marker in a liaison between 2 lovers, whether these lovers be Edmund and Mary, or Edmund and Fanny. I hope I've managed to show you in this video how in just a short piece of apparently simple narrative, Jane Austen enables us to see an episode through Fanny Price's eyes, making us keenly aware of and sympathetic towards the inner life of the heroine of Mansfield Park at a moment in the novel that is only of brief duration, but is nevertheless packed with the most intense feeling. Thank you for listening.